So how much does a good mule cost? If you like equines, buying a mule can be one of the most fulfilling and enriching investments of your life. But if you buy the wrong mule, it could end up being a frustrating and dangerous waste of time, energy, and money. Alyssa and I have bought 5 mules and 1 horse in the last 3 years, and we've learned quite a bit in the process of building our little herd. So I'm going to break this video down into 2 parts. First, I'll share what we paid for our mules and our horse, and then I'll share the top 3 tips for buying the right mule for your specific situation. We'll go in the order that we bought our mules, so that'll start with old Clyde. Clyde cost $5,500 and he was 3.5 years old when we bought him. He'd packed elk in the past and he'd been trail ridden quite a bit, but he was still pretty green. One of the best things about Clyde was he liked people, and you could tell that his previous owners were good people and they had treated their stock well. But he was afraid of cows, still kind of is, and he still had a long ways to go before he was a finished mountain mule. Next up, we have my personal mule, Reata. Reata cost $2,700 and she was only 4.5 years old when we got her. She had packed meat in the past, but she was extremely fearful. When we went down to look at her, she was tied up to a horse trailer when we got there, and she would pull back out of fear anytime a person would walk up to her. You could tell that she had just had some bad experiences in the past, and that's usually a pretty substantial red flag if you're looking to buy a mule. When we were looking at her, the owners told us that she had to be ridden in an aggressive bit, she couldn't cross water, and she had to be shoed on a shoeing table. But the 2 big pros of Reata are her flashy looks and her really good conformation. We understood right off the bat that we had our work cut out for ourselves as far as trying to earn her trust, but it was something we were willing to put in the time and effort to do. Thankfully, Reata naturally has a sweet personality, and over time she's learned to trust us and she's becoming a super good mountain mule, but it did take a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of going really slow. I do want to take a minute to just say that people who are kind of hard on mules aren't necessarily bad people. I don't want to sound like I'm judging anyone when I talk about a mule's past experience. Some people were just raised treating mules a certain way and they've never known anything different. It's not like they chose to be hard on their mules. That's just the way their families have done it in the past, and that's the way they go out and they get the job done, and that's what works for them. I had the privilege, although sometimes it feels like a disadvantage, of diving into horsemanship after I finished college. And I was fortunate that there's a lot of information out there, DVDs, things on YouTube about how to get along well with horses. And having the privilege of just riding mostly for fun and to get back into the mountains, I was able to just choose a style of horsemanship that was attractive to me and that I thought seemed enjoyable and stick with that. Now that brings me to our 3rd equine. She's a little different than the rest, but we love her just the same. It's our horse, Timber. Now we bought Timber for $2,000 as a completely unstarted yearling. She's a registered AQHA mare with foundation bloodlines, and we really like her Grula coloring. Now we bought Timber for a few reasons. First, her size and good bone would make her a good mule mama in the future. And second, they say having a mare in your herd helps your mules stick around camp in the backcountry. You can tie up the mare in camp, hobble the mules, turn them out on some pasture or meadow up in the backcountry, and your mules are likely to stick around with your mare in camp. Now that'll bring us to Cedar. We bought Cedar for just $1,000 from a friend. Cedar has great conformation and she'd been treated extremely well by her previous owners. Her mama was a quarter draft mare, so Cedar has great conformation and she's going to make a really good pack mule in the future. But the only reason why Cedar was so cheap is she had a bad experience with the saddling when she was a youngster. Now the way I remember the experience that Cedar had when she was a youngster is her owner had been working with her. He got the saddle on her, but the cinch wasn't all the way tight yet. And Cedar kind of spooked, pulled away, took off. The saddle rolled underneath her and she bucked around the pasture for a long time with the saddle underneath her until she was finally tired enough and exhausted enough that he was able to get up to her, get the saddle unfastened. But long story short, it was a real bad experience with the saddle with her, and so she's had a little bit of fear of saddling ever since. Now that was obviously a pretty traumatic experience for Cedar, and even after a lot of hard work with her, she still gets a little tight when you're putting on the saddle, and especially when you go to cinch her up. She's definitely improving though, and she'll get better and she'll become a really good saddle mule, pack mule, whatever we end up deciding to turn her into, but that's why she was so cheap. It's pretty common for people to sell a mule that they've had a bad experience for cheap, and they just say in the listing, just haven't had the time for her that I thought I would, or she needs someone with more experience than I have, things like that. Now, thankfully, that wasn't our experience, but buyer beware. If you see a listing that says something like that, it's not necessarily that they just haven't had time for them. Maybe they had a bad experience and they don't want to make time for them anymore. Now that brings us to Josey. Josey's our newest and flashiest mule in the whole herd. We just bought her about 4 weeks ago, actually. We went down to Utah. We paid $5,000 for her as a completely untrained long yearling, which means just over a year old. She's 18 months old. Now, the reason that she was so expensive is probably pretty obvious, but it's just she has extremely rare and flashy coloring, which we were willing to pay a premium for. Now, we've seen a lot of mules with this flashy, loud Appaloosa coloring go for more like in the $10,000 range, and it's just because they're rare. Now, a lot of people will say you can't ride color, and that's definitely true. But these mules will live 30 plus years, so I say you might as well have a good looking one. Now, I would never trade good conformation or a good mind for flashy color, but if you can have the best of all the worlds, I say get a good looking mule. It's kind of like getting married a little bit. I prefer to have a wife that's sweet, smart, and good looking. Now I want to talk a little bit about a mule that we called Houlihan. Houlihan cost $2,000. He was a really pretty buckskin long yearling mule. His previous owners had treated him extremely well. They'd loved on him a lot, but they just needed to get rid of him for whatever reason. Houlihan was a mule that ended up just not working out for us. We had to get rid of him for 2 reasons. First, we were in the process of moving and we were thinking that our new neighborhood had covenants that allowed only a set amount of equines per property. That ended up not being the case. But the second and the main reason that we did get rid of him is because he just ended up not being a good fit for our herd. He was always biting Clyde, biting Reata, chasing them around when they weren't playing together. He would just be like pushing them around. And our herd was just never at peace when he was in it. Equines, they just all have their own personalities, and sometimes you'll get one that's just not a good fit. And he was a good little mule, he just didn't fit into our herd. So I guess that's just kind of a word of caution. Reselling mules or horses is a pretty unenjoyable experience for us. So it's best to just make sure you have everything lined out as best as possible so that when you buy your mule or horse, you're able to just keep it and you don't have to worry about reselling it and trying to make sure that it goes to a good home, because it's kind of just a stressful and not a very fun process. So hopefully that at least paints a decent picture as far as what you can get in an equine on a reasonably low budget. Now let's get on to the top 3 practical tips to help you buy the right mule for your goals, your experience, and your specific situation. Tip number 3 is be realistic about the 3 variables that affect equine pricing. Now those 3 variables are looks, age, and training level. Now if you're wanting a mule that's young, flashy, and extremely well trained, it's likely going to cost you over $20,000.
31 pound dog over here, 31. Like their face over here.
So that counts people like us out. But if you want a homely looking untrained yearling, you might be able to only spend $1,000. The right balance will just depend on your specific abilities, your timeline, and your goals. Our personal equine purchases have been largely determined on our budget. For example, we wanted to keep each of our purchases around that $5,000 mark, which is still a lot of money for people like us, but we had planned for the cost and we knew the investment would be worth it for us. We also wanted younger mules because we plan to ride these guys in the mountains for literally decades into the future. Now we really wanted to buy safe mules, but we have both had experience with horses in the past, and so we were willing to exchange a little bit of training time in exchange for a lower purchase price. Let's take Clyde for example. Now he's not the flashiest mule, but he has really good conformation. He was only 3.5 years old when we bought him, and he had already packed meat, and he had had experience trail riding. Now Reata was flashy. She was only 4.5 years old, but she was afraid of meat, she was afraid of mud, she was afraid of people, she was afraid of literally pretty much anything that moved. It's literally taken a couple years of consistent time and effort to turn her into the reliable mountain mule that she is now. Now that brings us to tip number 2, and that is buy from someone you trust. Now this is a big one. Now you want to be able to assess your potential mule based on the 3 variables listed above, but unfortunately it is fairly common for mule traders to be a little bit dishonest about a mule's age and or training level. Now, since most mules aren't registered and the average person like me has a hard time judging the age of an equine based on tooth wear or conformation traits, it can be fairly common for people selling equines to be slightly dishonest about their age. And unfortunately, there are calming drugs that people use to make their mule or horse seem a little more laid back than they really naturally are. This can lead a buyer to think a mule is young and calm and really well broke, when in fact, that's just not the truth. Now, most people selling a horse or a mule are probably good, honest people, but you just hear stories of people being tricked into buying an equine that isn't exactly what they thought it was. So just buyer beware, and if possible, buy from someone who has a good reputation. It's similar with horse auctions and mule sales. Most people selling equines at those scenes are probably honest people, and the mule and horse are probably exactly as advertised. But we were actually personally at a local mule sale last year, and we watched a mule that was lame sell for $20,000. Now, what I mean by lame is just it wasn't sound. It was sore on one of its front feet, so when it would walk, it would bob its head. And an online bidder paid $20,000 for that mule. They were probably very disappointed. Again, the best way to avoid this is just to buy from someone with a good reputation. This could either be someone who's known and trusted in your local area, or it could be even one of the bigger auctions that has built a reputation for selling good, sound, broke mules. Now, we don't know a ton of people who regularly have good mules for sale, but a couple in the western United States that come to mind are Scott and Sandy Salee. They're up in Montana. They run an outfitting business, and they're very well known and trusted in the equine community. And there's also Sean and Nellie Peterson. They're down in southern Idaho. I don't know them personally, but they sure have a good reputation, and they sure sell good broke mules from what I could tell. Now, there's certainly many more good mule salesmen with good reputations that I just haven't heard of, but the main takeaway is get references if possible and look into the seller's reputation in the equine world. Now, there's 3 big mule sales that have great reputations as far as I know, and those are the Tennessee Mule Sale put on by the Reese brothers, and that's obviously over in Tennessee. There's Chrome in the Canyon Mule Sale put on by Premier Horse Sales, and that's down in southern Utah. And then there's the Jake Clark Mule Sale, and that is some of the finest mules in the country, and they're sold every year over there near Cody, Wyoming. Due to the good reputation of these sales, mules sold at these auctions are not cheap. Mules are a little more common back east, so probably the cheapest option out of these 3 reputable sales would be the Reese Brothers sale back in Tennessee. But the sales out west sell some high dollar mules. Just to give a little frame of reference, the average mule last year at Chrome in the Canyon sold for $14,500, and the high selling mule cost $32,500. Now, if you think that's a lot, let's look at the Jake Clark Mule Sale. Last year, the average mule at the Jake Clark Mule Sale sold for $17,700, with a high-selling mule costing $60,000. Now, this sounds like a ton of money, and it certainly is, but if you're someone who's been financially successful and you're looking to invest some of that money into a really good mule, these sales can be a good place to look. Now that brings us to the number 1 tip that I would have for someone looking to buy a mule, and that is buy according to your experience level. If you buy a mule that's too green for you or too high strung for you, it is not going to be an enjoyable experience, even if it is the prettiest or cheapest mule in the world. But if you are able to buy a mule that's a good fit for your experience level and your goals, you're sure to get lots of miles and smiles out of that mule for years to come.